This past week, our bishop, John Scholl, I see him every other day in the office where I work, and he told me this story in the midst of conversation I thought was particularly powerful I wanted to share with you this morning. I'm sure many of you can relate here. So Bishop John Scholl, he played football in high school, and his team, like most other teams, had a rival team, right? And this rival team, for them, it was Frankfurt. Frankfurt High was a team that from a very, very young age, his school was taught to hate, right? They were the mean team. They were the team that lacked sportsmanship. They were the cheaters, right? We were the good people. They were the bad people. And every game, every time they played with them, they knew that they had to win because they were the good team and Frankfurt was a bad team, right? In retrospect, Bishop shared how, they probably weren't as bad as they were taught, but all it took was just one player to have an aggressive move or just one player to possibly be cheating. And it validated all the assumptions that they were taught, right? Demonizing a group of people, calling them bad, we're good, especially if they're on the opposing team, right, comes somewhat naturally to us, and we see it in our everyday lives. According to Henry T. Conserva in his book, Propaganda Techniques, he writes that the demonizing the enemy is the oldest state propaganda technique aimed to inspire hatred toward the enemy, necessary to hurt them more easily, and to preserve and to mobilize your allies. These techniques reached a peak, especially during the World Wars, when the Germans were depicted as baby-eating monsters. The Japanese, not too much different. They were considered ugly, drug-addicted people. These words and titles come from fear. They produce rage and anger, a united rage and anger, and it paints a broad image of demonizing a whole people group. But here's the truth. Demonizing of people creates a never-ending battle because it distracts us from the real fight. I'll say that again. Demonizing of people creates a never-ending battle because it distracts you from the real fight. This morning we read from Ephesians 6, where Paul was writing to the church in Ephesus, urging them to fight the good fight. Verses 10 and 11 said this, right? Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against, in this morning's translations, the wiles of the devil, right? Other translations say the devil's schemes. Notice that this translation doesn't say the devil's attacks, right? Which they are, but Paul goes into detail to reveal the devil's means of attacks. The devil's schemes, right? The main means of attack by what we call the enemy, evil, is through lies, through schemes. John 8:44 says this, Satan was the murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there's no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. When we lie, we are speaking in the language of the devil. That's his native tongue. That's his native language. From the very first time we see Satan in Scripture in the garden, right, he lies to Eve to tempt her to disobey God, right? If you notice, Satan never comes out and says, when he tempts us, never says, hey, kill this person, right? Usually the temptations of Satan are much more discreet. There's a scheming involved, right? He will say, you don't have to read the Bible today, right? You don't have the time to do that. Oh, but you don't have to help that person. You might put yourself in danger a little bit, right? You got to be safe. There's little lies. He will embed little lies in the midst of what sounds like truthful words to get you to take one step away from the truth at a time. In the sin of committing adultery, right? No one accidentally ends up committing adultery, right? It's not like, oh, wait, you're not my wife, right? That's not what happens. Usually, right, it's little lies. Oh, she will understand more than my wife what's on my heart right now. Oh, It's okay to be alone with this person. We're just friends. Oh, we're just holding hands. And so on, the little lies takes us down the path to sin. Right? Satan is a schemer. He is the father of lies. And one of the greatest lies that most of our world has bought into is that Satan doesn't even exist. That evil does not exist. That a person, right, that there are no spiritual forces or systems of evil at work in our world, that a person is the one who is evil. Right? There are the good people and that there are the bad people. There are the people who are good, there are the people who are evil. That a group of people is responsible for evil. And yet, even though we execute criminals, we destroy whole regimes, it seems as though when we bring down one, two rise up after the other, right? When Hitler and Nazi Germany fell, next came many more military dictatorships throughout the world, including, right away came to mind was Mao Zedong of China. Many don't know that he killed more people, millions more than Hitler ever did. I remember when Osama bin Laden was finally found and taken down, people rejoiced. But in the ashes of Al-Qaeda came ISIS, right? When you fight against people, when you fight against human beings, the battle never ends. Because when you fight against people, when you fight against people, you are being distracted from the real fight. Verse 12 of today's reading said this, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." In the spiritual realm. So our fight, brothers and sisters, our fight is not against your neighbor. Our fight is not against another person sitting in the pews in our church. Our fight is not against Mexicans or Islamic terrorists or illegal aliens. Our fight is not against the conservatives or the liberals. Our fight is not against people of different political parties. Our fight is not against gun owners or climate change activists. Our fight is not against your brother. Your fight is not against your sister. Your fight is not against your parents or your children. Your fight is not against your in-laws. Your fight is not against people. Your fight is not against flesh and blood. Our fight is against the powers of this dark world, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Our fight is not against people, but the evil systems that are behind it. During the Super Church Conference, we heard from Dr. Tony Campolo, and he said that, so many people, they like to separate people from good people over here, bad people over there. But if you were really to divide people in good and evil, everyone will be cut right in half, right? Because the evil forces are working behind you. It's not the people that we are to fight, but the systems behind it. Just last week, former NPR CEO Ken Stern published a book titled "Republican Like Me: How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right." I'll say that again. The title is funny. It's "Republican Like Me: How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right." So especially during the 2016 election, and former NPR CEO Ken Stern, he watched the increasing polarization of our country with growing concern. And now, Stern was a longtime staunch Democrat, right? And but in the midst of the election season, he felt forced to acknowledge that his own views were maybe too one-sided, that he was too absent of any exposure of the, quote, other side. In fact, his urban neighborhood in Washington, D.C. was so politically liberal, and much like how he thought, that he couldn't find a single Republican even by asking around. So for 1 year, he traveled across the country. He crossed the aisle to spend time listening, talking, and praying with people that he did not agree with Republicans. With his mind open and his dial tuned to the right, He went to evangelical churches. He shot a pig, went pig shooting in Texas. He stood in pit row at a NASCAR race. He hung out at Tea Party meetings. He even sat in Steve Bannon's radio show at one point. And he consulted with some of the smartest people the political right had to offer. Stern said that once he left his, quote, liberal bubble, once he began to have conversations with people on the other side, he realized that the United States is an incredibly moderate country, as he put it, and tends to gravitate towards the middle, but the political parties and the media environment does not necessarily express this. Stern, he remains liberal, he remains a progressive, but he did say that his perception on one particular issue changed, and his perception on gun control had changed. I found this quite interesting. He said he couldn't shake the fact that while gun ownership has gone up, gun-related homicides has decreased in the last 20 years. And he still believes in better gun regulations, that we could do better in our country with that. But he also sees that the issue is much more complex. The issue was much more complex than he believed prior to his trip around the country and prior to meeting people from the other side of the political spectrum. You know, it is so much easier to be with people that you agree with, to be with people that look like you, people that talk like you, that think like you, and to demonize the other group, right? It is much harder and much messier to see people as human beings and to build relationships with them, to listen to their stories as Stern did. But that is what Jesus also did. You see, he didn't demonize people, but he developed relationships with people that lived differently than him, people that otherwise society considered an outcast, that society had demonized. Jesus often could be found having lunch with prostitutes and tax collectors, people that people just hated. There Jesus was, eating with them, much to the chagrin of other religious leaders. You see, where Satan's weapon of choice is scheming and lying, specifically pitting people against other people, Jesus' weapon of choice was this: relationships. Because once you have a relationship with a person, even if that person is someone you disagree with, actually, especially if that person is a person you disagree with, the issues might become messier. The issues might become a little more complex, but it also becomes much closer to the truth. Now, Bishop John Scholl's story took an interesting turn. Remember, he was a big football player. Frankfurt High was the enemies. Well, guess what? Many years later, when he first became a United Methodist pastor, guess where he was appointed? Frankfurt United Methodist Church. Naturally, some of the parishioners, right, played football back in high school, and they were of similar age with him. So they recognized him from games. Hey, aren't you from such and such high, and you played us? The years that followed, Bishop explained to me, were some of the most eye-opening years of his life. These people that he was taught were evil and scheming and cheating, right? They were cheaters. These people were kind, generous, loving, and God-honoring. As he got to know them better as their pastor, he realized they weren't the good people or the bad people. They were just people, just like him. So, Conklin Church, demonizing of people creates a never-ending battle because it distracts us from the real fight. And the real fight is to build relationships and to love others, especially those that we disagree with. Our struggle, our fight, is not against flesh and blood, but against the powers of darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms, the forces that tell us to hate others, the forces that tell us to harm others. Our means of fighting that battle is to love others, to listen to others, to engage in relationship with others. Let us stop the demonizing. Let us stop the madness. Amen.